1 and 2 Samuel provide the solution to the problem that the book of Judges raised: leaders. First, there's Samuel, the leader that God provides. He's the first ray of light, if you like, in the spiritual darkness that Israel has wandered off into. Samuel is a judge to lead the people, a prophet to instruct the people, and a priest to mediate for the people. And yet, for all his efforts, it's a bleak backdrop in Israel. And these early chapters particularly vividly illustrate how people defy God and how foolish it is to do so. And in the book, there are lots of bad responses to God which we ought to learn from. Secondly, there's Saul, the king the people choose. Panicking at the first sign of danger, God's people trade him in for another model, for a king like the nations, who will fight their battles, who will lead them to victory. And whilst this substitute king is what they'd asked for, that's what Saul means, by the way, he's not the king that they had hoped for, because ultimately he was their choice, not God's choice. And that's another thing to look out for in these two books, that the way that God works and the people that he chooses to use are not often the way that we would choose to work or the people that we would choose. But the story of Saul only goes to show that what happens when we take things into our own hands rather than entrusting ourselves into God's hands. Thirdly, there's David, the king God chooses. God plucks David from obscurity and then anoints him as king. And yet, for the rest of at least of 1 Samuel, David remains largely in obscurity, often in danger, not yet revealed as king, and definitely not reigning as king. And as we read through it, the experience of David, the anointed king, the Christ, will drive us towards Jesus Christ, the Son of David. In his circumstances, often hidden and hated and hunted by his enemies. In his successes, steadfast faith in trial and stunning victories in battle. But even in his failure, David drives us towards Jesus. Not least David's failure with Bathsheba, because we're left looking for the one who would share the sufferings and the successes of David, but not his sin. And only Jesus fits the bill. And finally, we continue with David in 2 Samuel, the king God establishes. Despite rebellion within his household and threats from outside the kingdom, David knew that the Lord had established him as king over Israel and had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people, Israel. God provides a leader because he loves his people. The books of 1 and 2 Samuel are all about leaders. They show Israel looking for a leader, any leader, but they should leave us looking not just for any leader, but for God's leader, Jesus, the king that God has chosen.